So, just a moment ago, I was reading this article on high agency, and basically, the writer was explaining how high agency is the skill that we need most in the 21st century. Now, right off the bat, I thought the article was really good. It scratched an itch in me that I really enjoy scratching, one where it basically says, I can take control over life, I can shape my own life, I can have a growth mindset, and that is all really cool. But I also want to dig a little deeper because I also feel that in this sort of writing, there can be maybe hidden tensions, maybe contradictions, maybe nuances, which I think are often missing. So I just wrote a few of those down, and I just want to sort of share them in a video format, perhaps in a very high agency way, and just share what I stumbled upon. So I think the main thesis of this essay was basically saying we want to have more people that are high agency. And the thought experiment that the writer used for this was basically saying, imagine that you are in a third world country and you're in a prison and you only get to make one phone call. Who is the person that you would call? And the person that comes to mind is probably a very high agency person, right? They're someone who gets things done. And the analogy he used was one of a chair, where he was saying high agency people have three key traits. They have clear thinking, a bias to action, and they're disagreeable, right? So clear thinking means they actually think things through in a way that makes sense. Their thoughts aren't all muddy. You actually remember your thoughts. You have unique thoughts. You polish your thoughts. You're not just thinking thoughts without paying attention to them. Then I think the bias to action relates to, are you someone who just thinks about things, or are you someone who actually does things, right? Are you just planning until infinity, or do you actually take action on the plans that you make? And the disagreeability in this is, to what degree are you able and willing to go against the grain, right? Because we are tribal species. We're always hanging out with other people. We always want to be part of a group. Are you willing to go against that group? Now, on a whole, I think these are good traits, but I also want to dig a little deeper. So I wrote down a few of the friction points that I have with this idea of high agency. The first one is that I think there's a real risk in trying to be an outlier for the sake of being an outlier, right? So ideally, when you're being high agency, there is an issue that you see or something that you think needs to change, and then you go out and change it, right? That's a high agency move. You see this thing happening, you're like, oh, I think there's a better option, or even having the idea that there could be a better option, and you go out there and change it. But the risk there is, especially like sort of these articles in the self-development sphere, is that you start identifying with someone who takes a different path, right? So for example, my hair is blonde right now. My mom celebrated her 60th birthday, and we went dressed as Kens and Barbies. And for this birthday party, I was like, okay, let's really lean into looking like Ken. I'm gonna dye my hair blonde. Now, according to this article, that's a high agency move, right? I'm willing and able to do something that other people probably won't. And in the moment, it might be a bit weird, like, why the fuck would you do that? But then 10 years from now, when we all reflect back on that party, my mom and my family might be like, oh, wow, remember that time when you and your brother dyed your hair blonde? Now, on the surface level, that indeed looks like a high agency move. But I think an important distinction there is in the intent with which the decision is made. Am I doing this because it will give my mom a better birthday? Or am I doing this because I have a pride in being the one with the blonde hair, right? Am I doing this for someone else, or am I doing this for me? And I think a lot of people that are acting high agency or wanting to act high agency are not doing it because that's a better way to get to that end result, but it's a better way of showing that you are unique. I am different. It is self-development porn, right? You're masturbating to your own self-development. And this is something similar that you might see with people that read Nietzsche, right? The Übermensch, the one who transcends all these boundaries and transcends ways of thinking and lives in accordance with their own value structure. And then people are like, oh, but I am that Übermensch, right? I am better than these other people. I am the protagonist in my own story. I am the hero. And this sort of high agency thinking for me can very easily tip over into narcissism and self-aggrandizing. So I think that is a very important point to keep in mind. Are you really being high agents? high agency, I guess? Are you really being high agency? And are you doing that for the right reason? Because I think you can go against the grain, but still do it for the wrong reasons. That's another point that also stood out to me. There was sort of this point made that people stick in with the crowd, but to be high agency, you need to be willing to defy the crowd, which to a degree is true, but I think something that is important to keep in mind, and also the examples that the writer is using in this article, is that very often we point to examples that were successes, right? This is the survivorship bias. People that actually turn it into a success. For example, he mentioned the Wright brothers, which are the two brothers that sort of invented flying, and that is a success, right? And it even shares in the article that many other people have tried, but the success rate was 0, right? Because everyone who tried sooner or later died. That means that everyone who tried sooner or later died, and it was just these Wright brothers that actually made it out, right? And I think by focusing on the success stories, we do not appreciate that for many people, things actually do not turn out to be a success. And that to me has two aspects to it. The first one is the risk that you're taking and the trade-offs that you're both able but also willing to make. So another example that he shows in this article is of this father that used to work in a postal office. And he used to work in the post office like 50 hours a week, very boring work, but he was just going there. He was supporting his family. He seemed like a stoic and calm man. But then the moment when he died, his wife was there, his son was there, he was screaming as he was dying, right? And that evokes this very strong visceral reaction. Because you're like, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to go out screaming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make these high agency moves, right? I'm going to be different, which is like that sort of like almost self-aggrandizing point I was talking to earlier. I'm going to be different. I'm going to stand out. The thing that's not taken into consideration, I think, is that in real life, there are a lot of constraints. Some of these constraints are mental, right? Some of these constraints are stories. And I think that's what this author is also sort of trying to get to, like these self-imposing stories, limiting ourselves, putting this fixed mindset, can really limit the ability of the things that we're able to do in the real world. But many of these things, many of these constraints are also real, right? Not having enough money is a real problem. Not being healthy is a real problem. Having certain mental afflictions, maybe you have ADHD or depression, those are real problems. And by pretending that they're just stories, we're not being sincere and we're not doing service to the people who struggle with those, right? And you get the self-made man theory, like, oh, you just got to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. But we don't do that. You know, we get so much given to us that we haven't ever worked for. I think a great example that I always think of is high IQ, right? IQ is largely inherited. Like we cannot really improve our IQ. We can decrease our IQ by doing all sorts of things, but we can't really improve our IQ. It's not something we talk about a lot, but IQ has a really big impact on how successful you can be in the real world. And if you are just born more smart, there's a very high likelihood that you can be more successful in the world, right? Similar to the example of the Wright brothers who invented flying, the fact that they could go out and engineer a engine and a plane, and they had multiple years of time and energy and resources to work on this project. Those are all privileges that you have. And I think it's always important to keep in mind, some people simply do not have those privileges. And we got to respect that everything is a trade-off, right? So if you are being high agency, every time you're being high agency, you are also taking a risk. And in the success stories, those risks always pay off. But for every success, there's 9 failures, right? Many of these stories don't pay off. And then an important question to ask is, how big is the risk that you are taking? Is this a risk that will wipe you out? Or is this a risk that you can manage, right? Because if it's a risk that's going to wipe you out, maybe it's not smart to make that high agency move. If you're this father working in the postal office, working 50 hours a week to sustain your family, and you're like, I'm going to make this high agency move. I'm going to be a movie star, I'm going to make millions, and we will never have to work again. And you go out to Hollywood, you jump on a ship, and your ship goes down and you drown, right? You're wiped out. That is the reality of life. That is the reality of taking a risk. So I think it's very important to take into consideration, what risk are you taking, and who gets to take these risks. If you are more privileged, right? If you have more money, if you are more intelligent, if you live in a better developed country, the risks that you can take are much higher than someone else can take without wiping out. And I think that's an important distinction to make, right? Yes, we can be high agency, but that doesn't always mean we need to be high agency. Which is the other point I want to make, is that sometimes, yes, we want to break away from the crowd because the crowd is wrong. But very often, the crowd is also right. At one point, he sort of I think it's like tongue in cheek, but he sort of makes this point that game designers know more about human psychology than 99% of psychologists. Now, I think this is a thing that often happens in sort of this personal development and self-improvement space, right? We want to push away from the norm. And this is so easy. Like, oh, push away from the norm. All those professionals, all those scientists, all these institutions, they have it wrong. Instead, I know what the right answer is. And it's this thing that you've never heard of before. Truth of the matter is, very often having the counter position is not the right position, right? Many people who take the counter position are not right. But what people will then do is point to these few occasions, few moments where someone in history, like Galileo, was like, oh, but actually, the sun is flying around the earth and not the other way around. Rather, the earth is flying around the sun and not the other way around. And take that as sort of an example, like one person can have a contrapoint and that can become a paradigm shift. The fact of the matter is, very often one person does not have the right contrapoint. But contrapoints get you attention, right? If I take a stance that other people don't take, that is what gets you attention. And in an economy and an algorithm that is filtering for points that are against what might be the consensus, that is the thing that gets you eyeballs, right? So I think that's another important point to make. Just being the outlier for the sake of being the outlier isn't always the right thing to do. Another point on that quote on the psychologists and the game designers. I think a very important distinction there is that game designers literally make their own constraints, right? They constrain their game and you play within that container, right? And the amount of variables sort of determines how complex a system is going to be. A game compared to the universe is so widely different in complexity, right? It's comparing a candle to the sun. The complexity is so far apart that it's not fair to say, oh, this game designer has a better understanding of human psychology than this psychologist. Because if I was a psychologist, it would be easy for me to get someone addicted on heroin, right? I could easily hijack their motivation pathway. The problem is not getting them to do something. The problem is getting them to do the wholesome thing. And that is a big issue. That's why we have a whole self-development, personal development industry, right? We haven't cracked that code. How do you make people do the things that are actually serving them as human beings, right? So I think that's also an unfair point to make. Then the last thing on sort of this part of my, I don't want to call it a critique, more insights, reflections on this article. What if the group actually has a consensus that is the best for the human beings, right? In this article, he gives a bunch of examples of high agency people, and very often they're people that get something done in the outside world in some real way, right? They are the Steve Jobses, they are the Mozarts, they are the Wright brothers, all of these people that very often will be cited as examples. But then actually what he does is he also mentions how these different people have their own faults and failures, right? Like famous example is Nietzsche, this person writing about self-expression and self-actualization, actually being very miserable himself. And I think this is something you see very often, right? People that are really focused on this one thing and might be successful by our metrics, actually not at all living a happy life. Now, if we would contrast that, for example, to a religion like Buddhism, which I'm personally very interested in, maybe that religion, maybe that group of people has actually figured out how to live a relatively wholesome and happy life. Now, a high agency person might say, actually, I'm going to push away because we don't follow the herd, right? It's a herd. They're all like in this group think, I'm going to be different. But what if you're just being different because you want to be different? And by that, you are not actually reaping the fruits of generations of cultural innovation, right? Because you want to be different from the group. I think that to me is another very real concern with being high agency for the sake of being high agency. In closing, why am I reflecting on this article in this way? Why am I responding on this article in this way? Because this is a journey that I've personally been on for the past decade, and I'm sort of trying to find my way. I'm trying to find like what is the position I want to take in life. So I started out as someone with very low agency, right? I did not care too much about the world. I just cared about mostly just cared about short-term pleasure and gratification, and I wasn't really putting in any effort to make like real things happen in the real world or trying to be successful. Those were my teen years, right? Then at one point, I sort of started getting into this whole self-development sphere. I read The 4 Hour Work Week. I read The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, The Obstacle is the Way, all of the sort of staple books that you would read when you get into self-development. And I really became convinced of this idea, right? That you just gotta think big and you just gotta do big. And if you really want it, if you really have this high agency, if you have this growth mindset, if you have this grit, or whatever term you want to use for it, you can make shit happen in the real world. And that's sort of how I was living my life. I started to do things in the real world. I started content creation. I started this nonprofit foundation. I started engaging and interacting, and I was this outlier. I would dress different than the other people. I would do all of these different things. And it brought me a lot. But simultaneously, there was always this element of narcissism in it. There was me being the different person, me doing all of these things. There was a certain pride in being the one who is pursuing this, who is on this path. And then I actually started getting into a different philosophical realm, which is talking about the achievement society and how everything is commoditized. Now everything is serving the purpose of making money, right? Everyone's become a project. We're investing in ourselves. We got to earn money. We've got to become better. And it became more of this toxic thing. And I started seeing more and more of that in sort of this general self-development culture. It's a lot of masturbating on the self-development, right? Oh yeah, you just got to be more high agency. You got to have more confidence. You got to be more charismatic. You got to do X. You got to do Y. You got to do Z. And if you do all that stuff, you will be happy and you will live a successful life. And if you're just high agency, you're going to be one of these people that change the world. And actually, that is not the case, right? There's a lot of, like I said earlier, there's a lot of constraints for people. Maybe you come from a poor family. Maybe you have a debilitating disease. Maybe you just don't have that intelligence, right? There can be so many different factors that lead you to be a certain person or that constrain you in the things that you can do that it's not fair. And I was sort of reflecting back on my own privilege, right? I'm a white guy from the Netherlands, and even though I had my own challenges in my childhood, I still had a lot of possibilities, right? I could knock on any door, people would open. I could go to education, I could loan from the government, I could just study basically for 4 years without needing to do anything next to it. So there's a lot of privilege in that. But the thing then, what happened is I sort of went too much in the other side, and I got too much into this mental framework of we don't have free will. You are just a product of all of these variables stacking together, and there's actually nothing that you can really do because you're just a product of the environment and the constraints and everything coming together. And even though that philosophically gave me more understanding and compassion for other people that might not be acting high agency when we use the language from this article, it also made me personally less high agents, right? I was doing less of the things that I knew were good for me. But now I'm trying to find this sort of medium path, right? Instead of being high agency or low agency, can I maybe be middle agency? Can I still do the things that I think are good for me and are good for other people without doing them for the reason of showing, without doing them to make myself look better, or without doing them with pride, and while recognizing that maybe for other people that is not an option, and while being slightly more compassionate and kind to myself when things don't work out? Can I sort of find this middle path where I choose to challenge myself, choose to put these constraints and work within them, whilst also realizing and appreciating that sometimes those constraints are too small, and sometimes you simply cannot make that happen? That is sort of the question I am thinking about a lot right now. And that's why this article really tickled me in the right way, because the one side of me that was really into this high agentic life loved reading this stuff. I was like, oh yeah, I want to be like that. I am like that. Look at me. Like I would identify with that. But then immediately that other part of me was like, I see. You just want to be the high agent guy for the sake of being the high agent guy. You just want to be the outlier because that's a cool thing to do. Now, actually, can I read this article and can I distill the things that are really valuable to me, reject the parts that I think are not valuable to me, and can I integrate them in a way that they're actually wholesome? And yeah, that is the thing I'm going to try. As you're seeing, I'm trying something new here, hopefully doing something high agentic here by recording some of my thoughts. Let me know if this is something you like. Let me know if this is something you would like to see more of. And thank you very much. I'm going to get out of this room because I'm sweating my balls off. And see you for the next one, hopefully again with brown, black, maybe blue hair.